Hello, I'm Anna Demidchik. This is Laws of Achievement. And with me today is Rose Cuison-Villazor. She is a professor of law, also Chancellor Social Justice Scholar, and Director of Center for Immigrant Justice at Rutgers Law School. Good afternoon, Rose.
Good afternoon, Anna. It is so good to see you again after all these years. You look
Likewise.
exactly the same.
Thank you, and so do you.
Thank you.
How does that work? Amazing. Okay. Well, I'm really glad to be talking to you because it's been a while, right? We met back at Hofstra in 2010, I believe, where you taught immigration law. Is that what you're teaching now as well?
Yes, I still teach immigration law, and I distinctly remember the class in which you were a student. You sat in the front, and I recall whenever there were some questions that some of your classmates were struggling with, I knew I could just turn to you to say, Anna, what do you think? I mean, you were even back then, I think you were second year in law
I
school,
was.
and you were so passionate about immigration law. So
I was.
many years later, I see that you're working in that area. You have this thriving career, and I'm just so happy to see that you're doing what you love to do and you wanted to do back when you were still in law school.
Thank you. Well, I transitioned into criminal defense recently, but
Ah, I
yes, I
see.
did a number of years of immigration law. Most of my career so far has been immigration law, and it was very interesting. It was very interesting to see in practice how these laws play out. But back to you. You've had quite a professional journey. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, so you asked me earlier if I still teach immigration law, and I do. I had not taught immigration law in a while, though, because I had served as the interim dean at Rutgers Law School in Newark between 2021 and 2023, and then 2 years before that, I was vice dean. So when I was serving in this administrative roles, I just did not have as much time to teach these big classes like property law, which is my first year course, or immigration law. I am really excited to be going back to teach property and immigration law in the coming semesters. So I started teaching in 2006. So it's been a while. Before that, I was on a fellowship at Columbia Law School, where I focused the development of my research agenda on immigration, citizenship, and race, and how some of those areas would sometimes intersect with property law. But in terms of full time teaching, I began in 2006. I first started teaching at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas.
Mhm.
And then I moved to Hofstra, where you and I met. I spent 3 years at SMU and then 3 years at Hofstra. Then I moved to the West Coast and I taught at the University of California at Davis. I was there for 6 years before coming back to the East Coast, and I've been at Rutgers Law School since 2018. So it's been a journey. I've been on the faculty of 4 different law schools, all special, all unique, and I've been privileged to be able to teach immigration law and property law and race related courses in all 4 schools.
You've been in academic environment your entire life, right?
Well, no, not well. Most of my professional career, I was like you. I'm an immigrant. I immigrated from the Philippines. But I grew up in our first immigrant stop was the Mariana Islands, the Northern Mariana Islands, which is a U.S. territory. That's where I grew up. My parents were not academics. My father was a construction worker, and my mother was a bookkeeper slash accountant. And then for college, it was around the same time that the family then made its last immigrant stop to Dallas, Texas, the metropolitan Dallas area. And so that still is where one of my brothers resides, and most of my relatives from the Philippines had gone to Dallas. That's the where we ended all of us ended up together. It wasn't until after I practiced law in New York City for 4 years that I decided to then transition to academia. And so I would say since 2004, is when I became much more focused on teaching and researching and writing. And but before that, I practiced law. I represented immigrants in civil rights cases, and then before that, I was in law school.
Okay, so you did practice some law before.
I did, yes.
Where was that?
It was in New York City. After law school, I graduated in law school in 2000, and then I clerked for a year in Washington, D.C. for an appellate court. Then moved to New York City. I got one of those Equal Justice Works Fellowship. It's a public interest fellowship. I worked with New York lawyers of the public interest and
Mhm.
represented immigrants who faced discrimination in acts in healthcare because they did not speak English well. So I represented Russians and Koreans and Spanish speakers who were denied healthcare services because they could not speak English. I did that for 4 years, and then I then switched over to the Human Rights Fellowship at Columbia Law School.
What made you want to decide to enter academia and stay there?
No, when I was in law school, I was a research assistant for a professor. She was the first Asian American law woman faculty. Was she the first Asian American? She might have been the first Asian American law faculty at my law school, which is American University Washington College of Law in DC.
Mhm.
Anyway, I was her research assistant, and I was helping her with some of her research at the time on Asian American history. I helped to prepare her seminar on Asian American Pacific Islanders and the law. Having grown up in the Pacific Islands, I said, I think it would be really good for the class to include cases involving Pacific Islander issues. So she tasked me with that project of finding cases and law review articles and books that we can assign, whether she will assign to the class. And so I helped her do that, put together 2 weeks worth of materials, and then she included that in the syllabus. Then I enrolled in her class, and I ended up writing a paper about the Mariana Islands, and I had sent it out for publication, and it got accepted at a journal at UCLA Law School. So I sat down with her, and she was really excited for me, and she said, Rose, I think you should go into law teaching. And I never considered that. I never saw myself as someone who would become a law professor. I went to law school so I can become an immigrants' rights lawyer, a civil rights lawyer. That was my passion growing up. I thought that's well, at least in college, I thought that's what I would do. But then she put that idea in my head, and I was, to be honest, surprised and touched and inspired, because here was a professor who looked at me and said, "You can do this, you can be a professor." Uh, and at the time, most of my professors were not women of color. I love all my professors, but I wish that they were much more diverse. And so because she believed in me, I started thinking and seeing myself as someone who can be in front of the classroom, who can teach courses that I care about, and importantly, to be able to research and write areas of the law, and highlight stories of people who look like me, whose stories are not often shared in the classroom or much more widely. And so that's how I ended up becoming a professor.
So, was being a professor, is it something that you regarded as prestigious and an elevated position? Is that how you grew up, or how did that develop?
I certainly in the classroom, I looked at my professors when I was a law student as, it's a privileged position, that's for sure. They were in front.
Hmm.
They had a podium, they had a mic, they knew the law, and they were teaching students, right? I remember at Hofstra, I had a big 1L course, and certainly that was my experience at American. My first year courses had maybe 100 students, right, per class in the first year. And so you had the person in the middle of in front of the classroom who had command of the classroom. So they certainly, in my perspective, they were respected individuals who were successful, who were smart, And I especially appreciated professors who had empathy and who taught the importance of giving grace to students when they maybe did not have, were not really understanding things as well. And so I did think I held my professors at such high regard.
Mhm.
And so when I wanted to become a law professor, I don't think I didn't do it because of that. I wanted to be able to have the opportunity to research and to write about issues that I cared about. I wanted the opportunity to teach immigration law from my perspective, to teach property law from my perspective, and that's why I decided to go into law teaching. But certainly, when I was in law school, I thought that our my professors, and I still think this to this day, that they were incredibly smart and kind and inspirational people.
And did you see it as your mission to sort of bring more representation and diversity into the workplace by yourself being one of back then very few female non-white professors?
I did see that it was, I wouldn't say it's my mission, but it was important to me to, for the to be a professor that can inspire others to see themselves as lawyers and as a law professor also, that they too can be who they, if they look like me, they also can be in the same position that I'm in, right, a few years later. I do think that the legal academy and the field of law in general is still not as diverse as I would like it to be. I want more representation in criminal defense work, in in the government, in all areas, in big law firms, and in nonprofit organizations. I think it's important for clients to be able to connect with their lawyers because they might have some shared experiences. That's not to say I'm not essentializing. I'm not saying that you have to be a Filipino professor or a woman professor, but I do think there is a lot of value in being able to clients or students to be able to see someone who look like them, and
Mhm.
maybe that would be provide a starting point for a deeper understanding about the client or the student situation. I miss my clients. They were my clients where I represented community-based organizations, who had members who were undocumented. They were mothers. They worked really hard, and I admire them so much because there was a lot at stake for them to be able to assert their civil rights. They were right to be afraid that maybe if they complained about a doctor or a nurse or a hospital that did not provide them access to health care, that they might get in trouble, right? But despite all that, they still pushed for civil rights because it wasn't only about them, it was about the other population of limited English speakers in New York City who were entitled under the law to interpretation services. And so I love working with them. I learned so much from working with them. But even when I was practicing law, I already knew that I wanted to be a law professor. And
Mm.
so while I was litigating or engaged in organizing at night, I was also researching and writing, getting things ready for publication.
Mhm. What are the hardest things for you in your job as a professor?
Mm. It depends on the way I think about that is in the beginning of my career, maybe the first 3 years, for example, it was just hard for me to teach in a way that I thought was effective because let's take property law, for example. Go back to your 1L days, more than 10 years ago now, Anna. I mean, property law is grounded on 18th, 17th, 16th century laws, right, that are
Mhm.
still in place today. And so I recall how I thought it was challenging I mean, I love property law. I wanted to be able to convey the material to my students, but I also get it. Some of the opinions are old and just uninteresting. And so I had to find a way to be able to understand the material first, for me to become an expert in property law. and then be able to deliver my lectures in a way that's interesting and that would help my students to really understand, especially, for example, the rule against perpetuities. I mean, I didn't understand that in law school.
It's still a nightmare for the students.
Yeah, and it still gets tested on the bar
Hmm.
exam,
All
right?
the
Just a
time.
few years ago in
All the time.
California, and
Hmm.
which I think is cruel. That should not have happened, but it does happen.
Hmm.
So the first few years of law teaching, particularly in property law, I found it challenging because the some students probably thought of property law as old and uninteresting, and my goal was to say no. Actually, property law is the most important first year course from my perspective, and and so I wanted to be able to connect with my students with respect to that subject. Then immigration law is different because I'm an immigrant, so I was a lot more familiar with the statutes, with regulations, with forms, and I'm able to draw from my own experience when talking about some of the cases. Even though it's not really related to my experience, I can understand some of why some cases ended up the way that they did. And so that was to me, it wasn't as challenging. I think what made it hard over time was that I've had to move schools
Mm.
because so I my husband and I we support each other's career moves, careers and opportunities, and both of us, he's a lawyer as well, and both of us would have these opportunities to leave to go to another institution or another law firm, and as a couple that believes in supporting each other, then we've had to make decisions about why we should move to California, why we should move back to New York. And so for me, part of the challenge, just like for him, is that we've had to make some adjustments in our careers at all times. Perhaps when I think about it now, I've made so many friends because, and so has he, because we've moved so much, right? I'm in four schools. I know so many people at four different schools. Many professors stay at their institutions. And so for me, while it was challenging to have to move, change my email, get to know a whole new system, insurance forms, all that, it also meant that I expanded my network. I was able to deepen relationships with a whole lot more people, and I have students from Hofstra, from UC Davis, SMU, right? Dallas, New York, California, New York, New Jersey. I've taught at Columbia Law School as well. And so I feel that I have been exposed to many different, diverse experiences and diverse perspectives. And that has only made me, in my mind, a better professor because I can bring in those experiences into the classroom.
Of course. And you also raised two daughters, right? So how did you make that work? Like two kids is it's hard.
It was hard. When I first started teaching, my girls were 3 years and the other one was 18 months. And now they're 21 and 19, soon to be 20. And so they're both in college. But you know, when I was teaching at Hofstra, gosh, I've brought them since. So
Wow.
you might remember them. I would bring
Mhm.
them to school because if they didn't have school and we still had classes, I would bring them over, and and so it was challenging as a parent. It's just, I'm sure, for those other for lawyers who choose to have kids or are able to have kids, finding that balance is tricky. And
Mhm.
for me, it was also important to show them that this is that their mom has a career, has a job, and it's not easy. And so I wanted them to understand why there were times I couldn't go to a school performance because I had to teach my classes or I had to travel for work. Um, so it was important for me to be with them as much as possible, which as a professor I did. I had that luxury, that privilege, because I have a lot more flexibility in my job than my other friends, women lawyers who are moms. So it was hard, but it's the fact that my husband is supportive of my career. We shared our duties and obligations to our kids, so that way we can, if he needed to travel, then I was there for them. So it required a strong partnership to be able to do what we did.
Absolutely. Yeah, of course. Do your kids want to be professors as well, or are they considering other careers?
No, the oldest one does want to be a professor, but not a law professor. Although I'm still working on that. She wants to. She's currently studying history and critical ethnic studies, with a minor in creative writing. She ultimately wants to go to graduate school. Not sure yet which discipline, but she wants to be able to do that and engage in research on Filipino American history, which is still understudied in scholarship. The youngest one is a sophomore, and she is a musical theater
Mm,
major. She wants to sing, act, and dance, and that's something that she's been doing for a long, long time when she was in high school and middle school in New York City. And so, no, she does not want to be a professor. I think it's, but the older sister does, and so she and I talk quite a bit about law and history
mhm.
regularly.
That is so interesting. And obviously, you have the background to counsel and help and tell her where to look for resources.
Yes, that's not something I had. My husband and I were first gen in law. I'm the first in my family to uh, graduate from college in the United States and then go to law school. And then same thing with my husband. Our kids have the privilege of having us as knowing and being able to navigate the legal fields, right, and help them find opportunities through whether it's grad school or we're here to support them in ways that our immigrant parents just did not have. We didn't have that through our immigrant parents because they were working so hard all the time and they were just trying to make money to support the family.
Hmm. Let me ask you this. When you came to the United States, did you already speak English well? And what about your
Yeah.
family?
Right. So the Philippines was colonized by the United States for about 50 years. It was a U.S. territory in 1900 by 1898, and then it was not until 1946 that the Philippines became an independent country. There was a transition period, but because of American colonization of the Philippines, Filipinos know how to speak English. It was just before that, it was the Philippines. The country was colonized by Spain, so everyone spoke Spanish. And then by the 1900s, then they also started speaking English. So I knew how to speak English because it was taught in schools. I went to a Catholic school in the Philippines, and it was mandated to speak English at school. In
Hmm.
fact, if we spoke Tagalog, the native language, we would get a demerit. So that's how strong the mindset of you have to speak English in a way that at the time as a kid, I didn't understand it, but now I understand it. That's just it's part of ongoing colonialism at the time anyway. Um, that push more for assimilation and speaking English as opposed to instilling pride in being a Filipino person, right? With who should know the language and the culture really well. But what that did for my family and I is that, and my husband and his family was when well his parents immigrated to New York and then New Jersey, and my husband was born in New Jersey. They spoke English. That was not a problem for them. And same thing with my family. My parents and my brothers and I spoke English. I When we moved to the Mariana Islands, I was already 11, and so I spoke English. There's formal English, and then there's conversational English, and I learned conversational English at school and with my friends. And so, language, that was not a big barrier for us. There were
Hmm.
other barriers: learning the American way, learning culture, American cultures and norms, and also the Mariana Islands is different. It's a U.S. territory, so the cultural traditions there are also different from when we moved to Texas. That's the South. It's also different. Texas has its own culture, just like all other states, right? And but for us, to go back to your question, English was not a barrier for us.
Hmm. Great. It's interesting how much context matters, because in so many countries, parents, if they have money, they would send their children to an English speaking country to speak nothing but English and to study all of the subjects in nothing but English so that their kids would know the formal English and all of the vocabulary in different subjects and be able to speak on all this variety of topics and read and write. And then in another context, it's almost a bad thing, essentially, right?
Yeah, yeah. I think it's a double-edged sword because learning how to speak English in a country that was colonized by the United States, it makes sense that this push for Americanization is so strong because even though it became an independent country in 46, there's still a lot of American influence. It's not an accident then that there are many Filipinos who immigrated to the United States because before 1946 it was just like moving from one state to the other, right? There
Mm-hmm.
was no Filipinos were U.S. nationals. Did not get U.S. citizenship. They were granted U.S. national status, which meant that they could go back and forth. It meant that they couldn't be deported because the Philippines was part of the United
Right.
States. And so 46, that's not that long ago. And so the influence, American influence, is so strong, such that there are companies in the United States that hire Filipinos because of the language skills for whether it's Verizon, right? Someone, right? And so same thing with India. India, like it was also colonized by Britain, and so because of that, they know how to speak English, and so those countries are able to have people there and companies there have relationships with these with the UK or the United States because of colonization. But from the Filipino side, I also see the drawbacks of that. In that, it's not I've seen how Americanization has led to a sense of Filipinos not feeling as prideful of
Mm-hmm.
their culture, right? I've seen it more with my parents' generation that they needed to make sure that they became more Americanized and that their kids should be Americanized because they thought that was the way to be successful. And I can understand that. But at the same time, I wish that we stopped speaking Tagalog when at 11 years old because my parents believe you have to learn English, be able to speak it, and you got to start dreaming in English, which I did. But so I wish that didn't happen because my Tagalog skills are not as fluent. I should be much more fluent in that language because that was my first language growing up.
Well, I think it's also part of a decision to make it in the new country because I remember when I came to the United States and I realized that, you know what, this is not temporary anymore. I did not plan to stay here from the get go. But at the point I realized that, you know what, looks like I'm here. I realized I had to basically stop using Russian altogether. And there were several years when I did not read in Russian. I did not speak Russian other than once a week with my parents. I basically cut it out of my life and I was living in English only. And I think that was the only way to progress, essentially,
Uh-huh. I
at some
see. But
point.
you also speak Chinese, right? I mean, I recall that
Yes,
from school.
but not anywhere near as well as I speak English.
I
Obviously,
see.
it's
Got
actually
it.
kind of, yeah, I don't like the level of it currently. I'm working on it, like always working on it. Um, but I see that also you touched on some of the topics we discussed right now, Asian American, Pacific Islanders, Filipino. It's also something you're discussing in the upcoming book, right? So are you touching on these cultural aspects as well, or is it just the law that you're going to be discussing?
Currently I have two book projects. They
Uh-huh.
are they that I have a publisher that has agreed to publish them when after I finish writing the books. And I'll tell you about them. The one that one about Asian Americans and the law in general. It is called Asian Crit, and it is a book that I'm co-authoring with Bob Chang. He now teaches at UC Irvine School of Law,
Hmm.
and the book looks at what critical race theory is as applied to Asian Americans. Critical race theory has generated a lot of attention in the
Right.
last few years. Unfortunately, it's been banned in some states. The teaching of it and books related to CRT have been banned. That has, if anything, ignited more of us who are scholars in CRT to expand our thinking about it and to continue to write about it because we believe it's important to tell the world what critical race theory is about. And for Bob and me, Professor Chang and me, we wanted to contribute to the literature by talking about, well, what does critical race theory mean in the Asian American context? And so we're writing this book. Our Some of what we're hoping to do with the book is to talk about how Asian Americans have been racialized as perpetual foreigners through that happened through immigration and citizenship laws. Asian Americans, particularly Filipinos, but also some Japanese and Koreans and people from Southeast have become imperial subjects, either through formal empire, like the United States having empire over the Philippines, or through military, such as the occupation of Japan by the United States. And then there's other themes that we're hoping to explore in the book, but those are the two that I thought I would share with you. The other book is called Forbidden Love, and this
Mm.
is a book that's different from uh, it's not a general Asian American story, although it is still part of the Asian American legal history that I explore in my work. Forbidden Love is about the story of how the United States separated families based on race. And by separation, I'm talking about the separation of, in the 1940s, the 1950s, of binational mixed race couples from Japan and the United States. And so I tell the story of how the federal government used immigration, citizenship, and military laws to prohibit interracial marriages between Japanese women and white American soldiers and service members. And because they could not marry, because the United States military refused to marry them, that led to children being born out of wedlock, and that had
Mhm.
legal disabilities for them. It affected their ability to claim citizenship. And so the book focuses on the stories of three women who experienced family separation, problems with getting married and claiming citizenship. And what's fascinating about the three women is that it's a three generations. It's the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter, who all were part of the story of immigration, military, and citizenship regulations that led to separation.
That is so interesting.
Thank you.
Okay. So, but this theme of love and family and interracial marriages, you also wrote on it another book back in 2012, right? Love
Yeah.
on Loving the Virginia, right? What was that about?
That was, I was still at Hofstra when I was finishing that project. At the time, my co-author and I, Kevin Millard, wanted to commemorate the 40th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia. Loving versus Virginia was a Supreme Court case in 1967, which held that the state of Virginia's anti-miscegenation law, it was a law that said white people could not marry black people and white people could not marry other people of color, that was unconstitutional under the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause because the anti-miscegenation law promoted white supremacy, according to the Supreme Court. And so that was in 1967. And 40 years later, Kevin Millard and I wanted to explore where was the United States at that time with respect to Loving versus Virginia. We were able to get other professors to write chapters for the book, and in 2012 we published it. I wish that we had gotten our act together and did one at the 50th anniversary a few years later, but we just didn't have time because were already involved in other projects. But I'm really glad that I worked on that because that book project led me to the project I'm working on right now about forbidden love, because it opened up my an area of research into how the federal government also restricted interracial marriages. In the way we think about anti-miscegenation laws, we largely understand that as a state issue. That state governments were the ones that prohibited interracial marriages. but I show through for my book Forbidden Love that the federal government actually did that, and
Mhm.
it did that outside of our borders. And so in many ways we've undercounted the role of the federal government in restricting interracial marriages. It wasn't just within our borders, and it wasn't only in Virginia or in other states, because not all states had anti-miscegenation laws, but the power of the federal government meant that it was happening in many other parts of the world, right? And so that's it's important for us to understand that history.
I see. So, if you got a chance to write that 50th anniversary book, what would you have written?
I think we would have examined what was the rate of interracial marriages by then. The Pew Center did do polls, I mean, did research on that, and did find that compared to 1967, there were a lot more people who are getting married interracially. We probably would have explored that some more by looking into which among the interracial couples which groups were getting married more. So I know the Pew Center, as well as other scholars, have shown that the more common interracial marriages today, at the time are in 2017, are between white men and Asian women, and then after that, then there's just different. Combinations. And so it was I would have, I suppose Kevin and I would have wanted to ask questions. Why is that? Why is it that some populations are much more able to get married? I did participate in a symposium at Fordham Law School that looked into the 50th anniversary of Loving versus Virginia, and the piece that I wrote focused on how um, restrictions in property ownership restricted our ability to interact with each other, because if certain neighborhoods are segregated, right, it meant that we're not able to interact with people of a different race. And normally we find, at least at the time, most people found their partners through work or through school. Now, apparently, I just saw something online the other day. Most people find their partners today through those apps, those online apps, and so it'll be interesting to see how that. There are scholars who are looking into what role does race play in dating apps, right? I was interested
Hmm.
back in 2017 and looking at how did racially restrictive covenants, zoning laws, and other property restrictive laws, what impact that played in people's ability to get married on the basis, regardless of race.
Right. I was going to bring it up. We used to be so tethered to our physical environments and to our
Yeah,
geographical
yeah,
environments, right? But now it's not the case anymore. You can reach out to anyone across the globe and connect with them. Literally, it doesn't even have to be in the United States, right?
yeah,
As
and
long as the app
also
works there.
right. And like, look at us right now. We're talking through an app. I mean, because of the pandemic, it opened up more possibilities for people to use technology to learn, to get to know each other. And so that's this power of technology in helping, in changing the social landscape, right? Of dating, of getting married, and cultivating those relationships.
Well, I hope you get to write about that someday because that is a very interesting topic, right? What people do when they don't have some of the old restrictions and maybe they have some newer restrictions that come up we don't even know about yet.
Yeah, or maybe race still influences, right?
Yeah,
There are,
possible.
I'm reminded of a professor's work, Professor Osagi from UC Berkeley, and and he wrote about how blind people can also have are still able to exhibit racism, right?
Hmm.
So on the one hand we think, well, if a person is unable to see, then how do they know,
Mhm.
how can you be racist, right? But it turns out on his study that people continue that racism happens despite, or maybe because of, right? It's hard to know, because someone is unable to see, because there are other markers of race that
Of
people are
course.
able to use. And so with technology, I'm not sure.
Mhm.
There are professors, scholars have also looked into how apps have reinstated or reintroduced different types of racism.
Hmm. That is quite fascinating. Thank you so much for talking to me and for your insight and for sharing your story. It was very, very interesting.
Oh, well, thank you, Anna. It's so I was happy to do this, and I'm so thank you for asking me. And it's always good to reconnect with my former students. I like to know how things are going with them, and I'm so glad that you included me in your podcast.